Today we're going to talk about human inheritance. So we're going to be talking about the way that traits are controlled by different genes in humans. Three objectives today. We're going to look at what are some of the patterns of inheritance found in humans. We're going to talk about what are the functions of the sex chromosome, so the X and Y chromosome, and what is the relationship between genes and the environment. So we're going to discuss those three things today. Let's start out first of all just by talking a little bit about what is meant by human inheritance and what are the different patterns. And one thing you need to understand right off the bat is that human traits can be controlled really by three different ways. Okay, so it's not something as simple as we just have dominant and recessive genes, and if it's dominant, it masks the recessive. If it's recessive, it's masked. It's not that simple. What actually happens is you'll see it in three ways. The first way is you'll see single genes with two alleles. Now, this is probably the easiest one. This is the standard Punnett square that we've been doing over the last couple of weeks, where you have, capital B, lowercase b, lowercase b, or whatever. And so you actually have a dominant, okay, in the capital B, and then recessive traits. And so it's real simple. Things like our hairline, widow's peak, that's actually controlled by a dominant trait. So if you have the dominant trait, you'll have the widow's peak. If you don't have the dominant trait, you won't. Okay, if you have two recessive alleles. So for traits that are controlled by single genes, okay, with two alleles, those are pretty easy. It's kind of an on and off switch. And so those are the most common traits we think of. Those things like dimples, those things like hairline, those things, like a indented chin, all those types of things are single genes. But secondly, you can have situations where you have single genes with multiple alleles. So this is where you actually have multiple alleles that influence a phenotype. Okay, the example that we're going to use today, and I'm going to show you this in one of the next slides, is blood type. And we'll talk about blood typing and how we have, because in blood type we have A, we have B, we have AB, and we have O. So we have in that situation a phenotype, the blood type, which is influenced by multiple alleles, not just one. And then lastly, you can have where there's many genes, multiple gene inheritance, where literally you have multiple genes that control one specific phenotype. Things like human height, things like skin color, things like hair color. Those are examples of multiple gene inheritance, where we don't just have one gene, okay, with two alleles or with multiple alleles. We have multiple genes that control for that particular trait. Okay, so those are the three ways that we can see the effects of a phenotype or the effects of human inheritance on an organism. Now, before we move on, I want to take a minute and talk about the inheritance of our blood type. Blood type would be, in this classification, blood type is this second one. Blood type is single genes with multiple alleles. And so what I want to show you, a couple things. First of all, we can see that there's four different blood type choices, right? A person can be A, a person can be B, a person can be AB, a person can be O. Now, so you guys are aware, there's actually more to that. You can be A positive or A negative. You can be B positive or B negative. You can be AB positive or AB negative, and you can be O positive or O negative. So you actually have multiple choices. And we're not going to talk about the positive and negatives here per se. But you can see the combination alleles that are available in a Punnett square that produce this blood type. An A, person with A blood type, can have capital IAA or capital I lowercase I. That's the recessive allele. Okay, remember this is like a form of codominance. In a B blood type, you can be IB or IBI. And AB is when you have A and B. It just mixes and you get blood type AB. Or you can have the recessive trait of II, in which case you are O blood type. Now, let me show you just the blood groups and actually just explain for a second what's going on here. Because this will be really important in the spring, especially when we talk more about the human body. So basically, here's type A, here's type B, here's type AB, and here's type O. So here's what happens in blood typing. Type A blood are people that you have a particular antigen, okay, that's on the red blood cells, okay, and it's a little molecule that is antigen A. And so all the blood in a person with type A has antigen A. And if they have any other blood, okay, if they have blood type B or blood type AB introduced into their body will not recognize the other antigens, in this case the B antigens, and it will actually attack and try to kill those blood cells. It will make you really sick. So that's why it's important that your blood type is known. Okay, so these with anti-A, they actually have anti-B antibody in their system. Blood type B people would have anti-A antibody in their system, so they can't take blood type A or blood type AB, because if they take either of those, it will actually reject, in this case, the antigen A's. Blood type AB people have no antibodies. Okay, they have A and B, so they can actually take blood type A, blood type B, and blood type O, which we're going to talk about. O is the recessive. Remember we said that was little I, little I. O blood doesn't have any antigens. It has both antibodies, okay? So blood type O can't take any blood from any other source except for type O. So here's why this was important for you guys. You go to the doctor and you are in an accident and you need blood for you. If you're a type A person, if you have type A blood, you cannot have type B blood or AB blood, but you can have A and O. If you're type B, you cannot have A or AB, but you can have B and O. If you're AB, you can have any type of blood because you have no antibodies that react. You are what we call the universal recipient. In fact, if you're an AB person, that's great for you because it doesn't really matter what blood. You're in an accident, you can have any kind of blood as a transfusion. If you're type O, okay, you can only have type O blood. Now, the good news is type O is a universal donor, and so a lot of times blood banks will look for type O blood because type O can be given to anyone, obviously, and they actually will sometimes pay people to go ahead and donate blood, type O people. So that's what happens with blood types. We'll do some Punnett squares on this as well. Moving on, we want to talk a little bit today about sex chromosomes. When we say sex chromosomes, what we're talking about is in the makeup of every human being, there are 23 chromosomes. Okay, now remember 23 pairs, right? So that means you get 23 chromosomes from your dad, and you get 23 chromosomes from your mother. Chromosomes carry the genes that determine your sex chromosome is the 23rd. So if I were to actually draw each of these chromosomes, and you have these little pairs, there's chromosome 1, and here's chromosome 2, and here's chromosome 3, and all the way down here, there would be chromosome 23. Okay? Chromosome 23 is the only chromosome that determines whether a person is male or female. This carries all those that determines all those traits that we consider gender traits. Okay, this would be physical appearance, okay, different things like that, the qualities that make you male or female. And unlike other chromosomes, these are known as what we call X and Y, and they can be different. Okay, obviously they have to be different because if they were exactly the same and coded the exact same traits, then male and female would be exactly the same. So we can see from a Punnett square here, every father can give an X or a Y. Every mother can give an X and an X. That's their only choice. You're going to get an X from your mother. So ultimately, the male, okay, is the one that determines the gender of the child. If the male gives an X, it's going to be a daughter. If the male gives a Y, it's going to be a son. And this, of course, gives us a 50-50 percent. It's a 50% chance that we're going to have male or female. And that keeps our population relatively close in case of genders. And so these particular chromosomes can be vastly different, obviously. Now, sex-linked genes are those genes that are carried on an X and a Y chromosome. So the traits that are produced by sex-linked genes are called sex-linked traits. So you have to think that in a sex-linked gene, those are only carried on the X or the Y. So if you, for example, if the male has an X and a Y, and he has some type of trait on the Y, okay, that's a mutation, that's a disorder that's going to cause problems, but he doesn't pass that. He passes the X instead. Well, this particular trait that's on the Y doesn't go down there. We don't see it. Sometimes you'll have a person who has a recessive allele for a trait and a dominant allele. So if they have a recessive allele for a trait, that trait gets masked. They're called a carrier, and we're going to learn about this a lot when we talk about pedigrees. They're considered a carrier because they have the capacity or the ability for their offspring to demonstrate this trait, even though that you won't see it in them. Now, here's a classic example. Let me show you this real quick. So this is actually an example of hemophiliacs. Hemophilia is a disease where people's blood doesn't clot, and so they can get a simple scratch, get a cut, and they can bleed to death because their blood doesn't have the chemical necessary, the proteins, to clot the blood. And so let's say you have two parents, right? In this case, we have two different sides. On this side, we have a father who is perfectly fine. We have a mother who is a carrier for the disease hemophilia, and so it's represented by a red colored X chromosome. Now, the mother has a 50% chance of passing down that trait. Because it's an X, it's dominant, right? So as that comes down, in the daughter, if they have a daughter that has this trait, well, that trait is going to get masked by the other X, okay? And so what you end up getting is a daughter who's a carrier. If they have a son, that the mother passes that particular X and not this one, like in the case of this daughter, or in the case of this son, if they pass this trait down, then that son will actually show hemophilia. Why? Because he's a son, he got the Y from dad, and the Y is recessive, okay, in this case for this trait. And so you'll actually have a son with hemophilia, even though the mother may not even know that she had that trait. Take example, the father. If the father has hemophilia, okay, which means he has an X chromosome that has that particular disease, so we know he's hemophiliac. The mother's not. All of the father's daughters, okay, whether or not they know it or not, will be carriers. And the reason why they're carriers is they're going to get a healthy X from mom, right, like this one and this one, and they'll get the diseased X from dad. So those daughters will both be able to pass on that trait. Now, the father cannot pass the trait on to his sons because it's on the X chromosome, not on the Y. And so his sons are going to get the Y from him, and so they'll be perfectly safe, and the disease will stop with on their side, even though it could get passed along to the female side. So that's just showing you how sex-linked traits can be passed on. Another example is color blindness. Color blindness is controlled by a recessive allele on the X chromosome, similar to what we saw in hemophilia. And we have carriers, those people that have one recessive allele for the trait and one dominant allele, okay? Don't have to have the trait, but they can definitely pass it along. Now look at the example here. We've got a father, okay, XCY. They have normal vision, okay? And we have a mother who's a carrier, okay? So she has XCXC. Now, what we're looking at in this case is the trait that's going to pass it on. Now, in the case of their Punnett square, here's what they could pass. He could pass the XC, the XC, he could pass the XC, and she could pass the XC. Father could pass the XC and the Y, and the XCY here. Now, here's the chance. If it's XCXC, this is a daughter with normal vision, okay? Right? Because right now the trait that we're looking at is the trait that is the small, the recessive, okay? If the X little c, because this is the trait for colorblindness, if the mother passes that along here to the son, why the son's going to show up as colorblind is because he does not have a Y that's dominant to block out or mask the XC, so he's colorblind. They could have a daughter who is a carrier for colorblindness, but she wouldn't be colorblind herself, even though her children, her sons, could be. And so that's why you'll see things like colorblindness oftentimes are found only in males, because in females, they're very often going to be covered up unless the father was actually colorblind. So you had a colorblind father and a mother carrier, you could actually see that trait. Remember, red-green color blindness is a sex-linked trait. So a girl who only receives one recessive allele for red-green color blindness will not have the trait, but a boy who receives one recessive allele will be colorblind. So that's why it is more common to see males with this particular problem. One last thing is we need to talk about how does the environment affect genes, because just when we think of genetic as being the only issue for actually inheriting certain diseases, but we need to understand that environment also helps determine the characteristics of an organism. It's not just our genetics. Poor diet, poor sleep, living in an environment where there's lots of disease, lots of smoke, things like that. Those are all things that can influence ultimately traits of that we have. If you talk about things that stunt your growth, or different ways that you can act by just your environmental factors that can affect who you are. So